All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out today. So, let me set the stage for you. It's 1992. I'm over at my friend Ian's house, and he says he has something really cool to show me. We go down into his basement, and he pulls out his Commodore 64, which to me was a really exotic computer because he was literally the only person on Earth I knew who had one. He sits me down, does whatever strange command line, disk swapping wizardry you needed to get a Commodore going, and then there's a title screen up there. It says, Joel versus the Predator. I was intrigued. I hit start, and there it is, character selection screen, and on the left is me, a little digital blocky representation of me with an unnecessarily large head, but still me, and on the other side, the Predator. So I select Joel, and next thing I know, I'm playing a game, an actual honest-to-goodness game. I'm running through levels, I'm shooting things are shooting at me, there's music, there's sound, there's a score. It was amazing. I couldn't understand it. How did he do this? He wasn't a programmer, and as far as I knew, the only way you could make a game was to be a programmer. So I demanded he tell me what was his secret. So he puts in another disc, and shows me something called the Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit. And he starts walking me through it, and he shows me how he had done all the graphics, how it had let him make the music, how he had done all the level design, and then how it had just packaged it all together into a game for him. It was incredible. I had never seen anything like this before. He had done what I had been trying to do for years. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think for many people, when you start playing games, you start to think about the kind of games you would make yourself if you could. For me, those early years, those dreams took the form of sketching out Super Mario Brothers levels in my notebook. This is not one of my sketches. This is Shigeru Miyamoto's sketch, and it's much more adorable than anything I could ever do. This is actually one of my sketches from a middle school notebook, and I assure you, it is definitely not a 100% ripoff of Kakariko Village from Link to the Past. So for some people, this desire to make games pushed them into programming, because that's how you did it. You learned how to code, and you learned how to build your own game from scratch. But for a lot of people like me, the jump from sketchbook to coding is a pretty big hurdle. So what were people like me supposed to do? Well, fortunately, some early video game pioneers came to the conclusion that sometimes making games could be just as much fun as playing them, and they set out to create tools that would let people like me, more technical novices, sit down and do just that. And in doing so, they created a whole new genre of what we would call game makers. So today, I want to walk you through what's almost 4 decades now of game makers, look at some highlights, and really how they've changed over time. So let's start off with 2 questions. Number 1, who am I? I'm Joel Haddock. I'm a designer at Unmat Path. We're a small independent studio out of Baltimore focused on narrative experiences for mobile devices. More relevant to today, I'm someone with over 25 years of personal experience tinkering around with game makers, which is a very polite way of saying I'm approaching 40. The more important question, what is a game maker? And I think it's worthwhile to take a moment to really define a game maker and how it's different from a mod tool or a game engine, because there's a few things that really make them distinct. First of all, a game maker stands alone. It's not a level editor, it's not a mod kit, it's not attached to a larger game. A game maker is a piece of software that you can sit down and it should have a sole purpose of making a game. Secondly, game makers do not require any scripting or coding. If you can't sit down at a game maker and make a game without coding something, then it's probably not a game maker. The third thing is that what you create with a game maker should be shareable. It's great to build your game design vision to reality, but it's much more fun if you can actually let someone else play it. So with the semantics aside, let's jump into the actual history. I want to start in 1980 with what I would really call a precursor to the game maker idea, and this is with a program called Aemon. Aemon was a freeware text adventure RPG title. You had a parser interface with some RPG stats, combat, dungeon crawling type adventure. Now, there were a lot of games like this out on the market at the time, but what really made Aemon stand out was that its creator, Donald Brown, really intended for Aemon to be a framework upon which other people could build their own adventures that they would then share and add to the program. So the main disc was sort of a hub, a main hall, where you would create your character, do all sort of management, and from there you would put in other discs to go to other adventures. The game came with a handful of Brown's own creation, but again, he wanted people to make their own to give to other people. To do that, he published all of the technical documentation to allow users to do just that. And it turned out to be pretty popular. By 1984, we actually see the formation of the National Aemon Users Guild, which was with the intent of connecting people across the entire country to share tips and tricks on design and actually share their adventures with each other. Now, you have to remember, this is all pre-internet. So this is all happening on paper printout and via the postal service, which I think speaks a lot to the dedication of these fans at the time. So you'll also take note that Aemon does not fit the definition of game maker I just meticulously laid out a second ago. And that's true, but I really think it's important to take note of because it is one of the first examples of a game designer setting out to create a game with the purpose of people creating their own content for it. That alone marks its historical importance. Where we really start to see game makers come into their own is in the early 80s with the Electronic Arts creation explosion. Electronic Arts was a very different company back then, and they really put this idea of game maker into the public consciousness with a trio of releases through the early 80s. The pinball construction set, the racing destruction set, and the adventure construction set. I think these three titles for a lot of people of the early home computing generation really represent their first exposure to the idea of designing their own game. So the first of these titles, the pinball construction set, was released in 1983. Pinball construction set was created by a man named Bill Budge. Budge had previously worked on a pinball title called Raster Master, which is ultimately pretty forgettable. But the important thing is that Budge took Raster Master as a basis for his new idea, which was creating a tool to let people at home make their own pinball game using a predefined library of art, logic, sounds, all without having to do any coding. His original box copy actually sums it up really nicely. No programming or typing is necessary, just take parts from the set and put them on the game board, press a button, and play. Incredibly simple concept, and it was pretty popular, which is normally a great thing, except that in Budge's case, he was self-publishing, and he didn't really have the infrastructure to keep up with the demand. So he partnered with an ambitious young fellow named Trip Hawkins and his startup, Electronic Arts. Now, Hawkins had the goal of really bringing computer gaming, home computer gaming, into the mainstream. He wanted to make it respected as a medium. And part of that idea to him was accessibility. And he really felt that Pinball Construction Set hit that idea. So EA took Pinball Construction Set, wrapped it up in some sleek packaging, and pushed it back out onto the market. And it was still a huge hit. When all was said and done, it had sold over 300,000 copies and really helped establish EA as a player in the home computer marketplace. Now, I think a lot of what made Pinball Construction Set so successful was its ease of use. Again, there was no command line, there was no arcane interface, it was all just drag and drop, which at this point a lot of home computer users had never seen before, so it was a pretty amazing thing. Actually, Steve Wozniak sums it up pretty nicely. The greatest program ever written for an 8-bit machine, and for thousands, the software was their first experience with the GUI. I think that's a pretty ringing endorsement. So to follow up on their hit, in 1985, EA releases the Racing Destruction Set. Now, obviously we switched from pinball to racing game here, and EA also wrapped more of a game into this one. There was a basic racing game along with sort of a car combat model, weapons, of course. This is the era of Mad Max. People wanted that sort of thing. But again, at the core was still this idea of generating your own racing game. And it wasn't just a track editor. You could edit the track, the terrain, the weapons, the cars, even the physics of the races themselves. And once again, this is all wrapped up in nice, sleek EA packaging with an easy-to-use interface, and it was also a hit. So, the final release in this original trilogy is the Adventure Construction Set, which was easily the most ambitious and complex of these early construction set tools. The idea behind the Adventure Construction Set was basically that from scratch, a user could create their own Ultima-style adventure game. You could edit the graphics, the music, the combat, the magic spells, pretty much everything however you wanted. And that gave you a ton of freedom. If you wanted to do a classic tale of knights and dragons and daring do, you could. If you wanted to do Han Solo's continued adventures in the Outer Rim, you could do that too. It also was pretty technically impressive. It had an interesting feature that if you start in an adventure and didn't want to finish it yourself for whatever reason, you could actually let the program finish the adventure for you. And if you were even lazier than that and didn't want to start an adventure to begin with, you could just let ACS write an entire adventure from scratch. Now, these adventures were usually insane and borderline unplayable, but that was still pretty impressive. You have to remember, this is 30 years ahead of the procedural content generation craze. You'll also note that under number 7 there, it says select, let ACS write the adventure, then go do something else while ACS does its work. This was not idle advice. It took a really long time and a lot of disk swapping. So another fascinating point about ACS to me is that its creator, Stuart Smith, said that he was in no way inspired by Budge's pinball title in coming up with this. He said the idea for Adventure Construction Set came to him while he was working on accounting software to generate standalone COBOL programs for inventory tracking. I think this is a great example of taking a really, really boring idea and turning it into something awesome. So at this point in 1985, we've now had 3 big hits from EA in this construction set style. So I think we all know what the next natural step would be. More genre-specific knockoffs from other companies. The 80s was a time of very little shame, and everyone wanted a piece of this pie. So pretty soon, we see popping up all over the marketplace more and more of these construction set style games for different genre of games. Now, some were obviously more successful than others. In 1987, SSI enters the fray with their war game construction set. This takes this now pretty well-established EA model and applies it to SSI's specialty of war games. Again, we have a handful of basic scenarios coupled with a powerful editor to really let designers come up with whatever they want within reason. If you wanted to build a man-to-man Greek phalanx game, you could, or if you wanted to go all the way up to theater level World War III combat, you could do that too. Now, unfortunately, at the time, Computer Gaming World was less than impressed by this. They said the game's potential is limited by the failings of the system's mechanics and only suitable for novices, giving it 2 out of 5. Now, not to take too much issue with a 30-year-old gaming review, but only suitable for novices, I think is really the point. These were tools for novices. They were supposed to be a gateway to let people into this world. So, Computer Gaming World's opinion aside, the series proved successful and actually spawned 2 sequels over the years, Tanks and Age of Rifles. And sequels is definitely something we'll be seeing more of as we go forward. So elsewhere in 1987, we have the Shoot 'em Up construction kit, which I mentioned earlier. And aside from my personal connection to it and the fact that it is a pretty solid program, there's not anything particularly remarkable about it. I bring it up again more for a marketing concern, which is that if you have a program whose title's acronym is 1 letter removed from suck, I really suggest that you do not use that acronym in your marketing copy, because trust me, people will call it suck. We called it suck. So the rest of the 80s carries on pretty much the same way. We have more and more of these titles hitting more and more niches for different types of games. It's not until the early 90s that we really start to see the next evolution in game makers, and we hit what I really consider a splitting point. This is where game makers start to diverge into two separate paths, each unique in their own way. Down the first branch, we have what I call the sandboxes. These start to break away from this earlier construction set style model in a few key ways. The big one is they break away from being genre specific. They're not tools for making one kind of game, they're tools to let people make many kinds of games. And right along with that, they take advantage of new technology to allow people who have the desire to start to extend them far beyond their basic framework. Down the other branch, we have what I call the toolkits. Now, toolkits adhere more closely to this earlier EA style, but again, they start to develop some unique features. They continue to be genre specific, but what we start to see is a real connection to brands rather than genre. And hand in hand with that, we start to see the inclusion of a lot of professional assets going along with those brands. So in 1991, we see a good example of an early sandbox-style game creator with virtual reality studio or 3D construction kit, depending on which side of the Atlantic you happen to be from. Now, virtual reality studio was released by a company named Domark, and you can see that right in the title, they're really banking on this construction set lineage. And again here, they published this tool with a basic demo game that you could run around with. But really at its core, it was a sandbox to allow you to create the virtual world of your early 1990s 3D dreams. And it was pretty good at that. If you could get past what was arguably one of the single worst user interfaces of the 90s, you could actually sit down and in pretty short order, throw together some blocks, have a little world, run around, shoot some things, have some things shoot at you, push some boxes. It was a lot of fun. But the real power in VRS came with the inclusion of a scripting language that lets you add behaviors far beyond the basics that were included. Aha, I hear you saying, he just said earlier that you didn't need to code to use a game maker. And you're right, you don't need to code. You could sit down with VRS and create a game without writing any code at all. But by adding this scripting language, it created a good entryway for people who wanted to learn more about coding to start to do that. And VRS was a great stepping stone because the language it used was just a modified version of BASIC. If box shot, destroy box. It really was that simple. I spent many, many hours in VRS, and as someone who was not a programmer, I was still able to do some pretty impressive things, in my opinion, anyway. So the thing that really hurt VRS the most and probably kept it from being as big a hit as it could have was the fact that even for the early 1990s, it was pretty lousy 3D. And this was mostly because of Domark's own doing. They had several commercial games out on the market at the time using this engine, and they made the decision that they didn't want to put a tool onto the marketplace that could let people create games that would compete with them, which makes sense from a business standpoint. But it meant that by the time they had let their games run their course and decided to put this tool out on the market, the 3D engine was already several years behind the tech curve. You can see this was really what you were limited to building, and the line and the sphere were not actually even in the original version. That came in the sequel, and there was no lighting or shading, so that sphere was just a big flat circle anyway. Still, it came with an impressive library of pre-made shapes that you could load up, things like the virtual oven and the virtual whatever that is. So at the same time in 1991, we look at the toolkit side of things and we see the release of the Bard's Tale construction set, which I think is a great example of the first one of these. This was released by Interplay, following up on their successful Bard's Tale series of releases. If you don't know, Bard's Tale was a role-playing game. So why this starts to develop the toolkit idea is now we don't just have a creation set for a dungeon crawler, we have a creation set for a Bard's Tale dungeon crawler, and with all the concepts that are tied to that. And right along with that, they include all of the art assets from the previous Bard's Tale games, so now you really can create something that just screams Bard's Tale. And if you're a fan of that, that's a pretty important idea. Now, what's really interesting is they did also allow people to still release commercial games created with this engine. Though as far as I was able to find in my research, only one person ever actually did that, and that is the very cleverly named The Bard's Quest. I don't think it did very well in the end. So, in 1993, we see another company take this idea that the Bard's Tale construction set laid out and apply it to a license of their own. A license that I think we can agree is probably a little more widespread and powerful. That would be Forgotten Realms Unlimited Adventures, released by SSI. At this point in time, SSI had been releasing its highly successful Dungeons & Dragons Gold Box series for many years, and people had really been clamoring for a way that they could build their own Gold Box-style adventures at homes. You know, for a DM, this was an incredible idea that you could build your own computerized adventure that you could share with your friends. And Frua met that challenge, and I think really nails this toolkit idea. You have a very powerful brand with a very powerful license, coupled with a very easy-to-use editor, and paired with a huge library of professional assets. You have to remember, at this point in time, graphics have come a long way from the 8x8 sprites of Adventure Construction set, and it was much harder for somebody to sit down and create art on their own that would not look like something from 10 years earlier. So having these professional assets in your toolkit was a powerful thing, and meant not only did you not have to be a programmer to do this, you also didn't have to be an artist if you wanted to make something that looked respectable. So in 1995, we're going to jump to the other side of the world for something a little different. This is RPG Tsukudu Super Dante, which was a Super Famicom cart, the Japanese version of the Super Nintendo. Now, RPG Tsukuru really adheres to this construction set idea as well, but branches into a new genre, the JRPG, Japanese role-playing game. Now, ASCII, the publisher, had been building these tools for PC for several years, but Super Dante was their first venture into the console market for this. And by going to consoles, they really opened up this creation kit idea to a whole new audience of people. Now here, more than anywhere else, we see Super Dante get hobbled by this distribution idea. Sharing off of a console was a difficult thing, especially in an age of cartridge medium. But still, the series was very popular, and it actually still continues today. RPG makers have been coming out for many years with an increasingly odd style of numbering, which I'm not going to try and understand. But we also see a shift over the last 20 years from RPG Maker from a toolkit style to more of a sandbox, and that's through the inclusion of a powerful scripting language, which has really let people extend it far beyond that basic JRPG framework. Now, speaking of scripting, I think I would be remiss to have any discussion of game makers and not talk about Game Maker. So Game Maker was released for Windows in 1999, and I think more than anything probably epitomizes this sandbox style of Game Maker. It was not tied to any specific type of game, and a user could sit down and in a few minutes build out their own version of Pong or Pac-Man or whatever without writing a single line of code. Using a predefined library of behaviors and attributes, you could connect it to specific objects, make your own graphics, all through a drag and drop interface. But again, where we see the real power of Game Maker is the inclusion of its own scripting language, which let those who wanted to really build far beyond that. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that any of the games we've looked at so far in this presentation could be recreated in Game Maker by somebody with the wherewithal to do so. Now this, combined with the rise of internet distribution, really starts to make Game Maker a very powerful tool, not just for hobbyists, but for independent game designers who might want to think about commercial releases. And because of that, we've seen really an explosion of successful games over the past decade or so that have their roots in Game Maker. Things like Hotline Miami, Spelunky, a Hyperlight Drifter, and Undertale all of these at their core started out as game maker projects in one way or another, and I think that's a real testament to the power of the program. So after the release of Game Maker, we get into the year 2000, and this is really where things start to get a little complicated. By 2000, gaming has been around now for 25 years or so and has come a long way from those early days. And, you know, the expectation that people have for what games can do and what they look like has really changed. I may have skipped a few steps in there, but I think you get the idea. Now, it becomes much more of a challenge to imagine that a novice could sit down with no programming experience or art experience and produce something that maybe not even compete with a commercial release, but just not look like something from 2 decades earlier. It becomes a big challenge. Pre-packaging all those assets and all those behaviors into an easy-to-use tool, it's a pretty high bar to set. So we start to see a shift away from game makers and more into game engines and mod tools, things that are powerful in their own right, but aren't really aimed at that same audience. So it starts to look a little dark for game makers, but hope isn't lost. Like I said, things like Game Maker and RPG Maker still persist, are still out there, and even some of the older tools still get some love now and then. There's actually a program called Adventure Creation Kit, which was a pretty direct ripoff of Adventure Construction Set, that was released for DOS in the mid-90s, and its designer is still working on it today. He did an update in the mid-2000s to let it work in Windows environments, and at the time, he actually released a full title of his own making, Ultima 6 Part 2, Dude, Where's My Avatar?, to address some unanswered questions he felt that were lingering from Ultima 6. Now, you can see ACK is obviously a technical throwback, but it's free and it's a lot of fun to play around with. In the more practical sense, we see the development of things like Twine in 2007. Twine is a program for creating choice-based games, sort of narrative fiction, choose-your-own-adventure style games. The idea of Twine is it's very accessible, easy to distribute, and someone can sit down, again, without writing any code, and in a few minutes, type up a basic game and push it out in a shareable format to the internet. And Twine really fits this sandbox idea. Again, easy to use, you can do a lot with it, and if you have the technical willingness, you can start to extend it far beyond its basic framework. This has made Twine very popular with a lot of narrative game designers, a lot of hobby designers, and you've probably seen Twine games in places and not even realized it, things like The Late Show with Stephen Colbert and Adventure Time. Now, a little disclaimer, I do work with the creator of Twine, Chris Klimas, but I assure you it is a free program and I am getting 0 kickbacks out of this. So Twine shows that the sandbox style persists along with Game Maker and RPG Maker, but even the Toolkit style continues to have a little bit of a resurgence. In 2015, we see the release of Super Mario Maker for the Wii U, and Super Mario Maker really throws back to that idea of the toolkit. You have a very specific type of game, a very strong license, a big library of professional assets, all tied together in a super easy to use editor. Now, unfortunately, Super Mario Maker is also a bit of a step back in some ways. It is just a level editor. You can't make a full game with Super Mario Maker. And though it does have a distribution method, it's tied very closely to the game itself, and I think we can all agree it might have some rough spots. But still, there's something undeniably fun about it. And I think for many people, Super Mario Maker scratches an itch that they might not have even realized they have. And if you really think about it, Super Mario Maker brings us full circle. Because now you can take that idea in your sketchbook and you can turn it into reality. And that's a pretty powerful thing. You know, we have a new generation of gamers growing up every day. And I know they're still dreaming the same kind of dreams that I did. And in many ways, the barriers to entry seem so much higher now than they ever did before, not just from the programming side, but from the art side. And I think that having tools out there that can give people the ability to express their dreams and ideas in an easier way to really start to let them dream those dreams to reality is an incredibly powerful and important thing. And that's why I think it's worthwhile to remember where these game makers have come from and really continue to think about how they're going to change as we go forward. So if you want to learn more, I have a lot of links that I couldn't fit in a slide in any practical sense, but on joelhaddock.com I'll be posting these slides along with some more resources. Twinery.org is where you can go and pick up Twine for free, start playing around with it. Creatools.gamesclassification.com is an amazing, extensive resource if you want to see a listing of basically every game maker, game engine, and mod tool created pretty much since the beginning of time. Facebook.com/Adventure Creation Kit. As I said, work still continues on ACK. You can go there and pick it up and see what other games people are creating with it. And Steam and GOG. Some of these tools are still out there. Forgotten Realms Unlimited Adventure I know is available on GOG right now if you want to try it out there. And with that, we can take some questions. Yes, and you know, obviously there's a lot of tools out there that I couldn't fit in. And I did play around with ZZT. The ZZT is a little steeper on the coding side, which I think kind of differentiates it in many ways. I would almost consider it an engine rather than a game maker, but that's, yeah. Exactly, yep. Yeah, you know, I think that's a really good way to put it. They are, time-wise, they are right at that cusp, and I think they try to be like, and they're powerful. I think they're just a little more on the technical side than I would classify as a game maker, but again, this is a purely semantic decision. Okay, any other questions?
So you mentioned earlier there was a group that would like mail and distribute from each other by snail mail. For a lot of these programs, are there still communities or ways to access the information that way for the students, or are a lot of those like lost?
There are actually, and again, as I said, I couldn't include all these links in here, but almost for all the tools I mentioned, there are still communities out there, even if they're not actively still developing. Ooh, for some reason, I'm not getting any power here. Sorry. You know, something like 3D Construction Kit. There's actually, I forget the URL off the top of my head, but there is an active community of people who are not only still making games, but sharing them and have archived a huge selection of these games going back in time. Same for Forgotten Realms Unlimited Adventures. You can see people's creations almost all the way back to the beginning and see what people are still doing with them today. So yeah, it is, you know, it's great. The fans of these tools really have helped keep them alive and have helped keep the history of games they've created alive as well. Okay, anybody else? Alrighty. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And just shameless self-promotion, if you happen to have the guidebook app and feel like tossing me a rating, it's always much appreciated. And thank you very much.